Have you ever wondered why the most honest, kind-hearted people often end up crushed by those who aren't afraid to bend the rules? What if I told you that playing by society's rulebook might be the very thing keeping you trapped? Have you ever felt punished for playing fair in a world that doesn't? Share your experience in the comments. I genuinely want to know. We're taught from childhood that goodness is rewarded and dishonesty punished. Yet we live in a world where this simply isn't true. Whether you're a struggling artist, a corporate employee, or an entrepreneur, you've likely discovered that naive honesty can become a liability. Machiavelli understood this 500 years ago when he wrote, "A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in all things must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good." Friedrich Nietzsche later echoed this sentiment when he observed, "When virtue has slept, it will arise all the more vigorous." In other words, sometimes our moral rigidity must temporarily bend so that our deeper values can ultimately triumph. This isn't about becoming evil. It's about understanding the actual rules of human power dynamics that no one taught you. The first reality we must confront is this: humans aren't rational beings. We're rationalizing beings. We make decisions based on emotion, then justify them with logic afterward. Let me share a story that changed my perspective. A colleague of mine, let's call her Emma, spent 3 years working tirelessly on a major project, often staying until midnight to perfect every detail. When presentation day came, her manager took credit for her work in front of the executives. When Emma later confronted him privately, he simply said, "That's how the game is played. You should know that by now." Emma had been playing by the official rules: work hard, be honest, let your results speak for themselves. Her manager was playing by the real rules: control the narrative, manage perceptions, position yourself strategically. Think about that promotion you deserved but didn't get. Was it really given to the most qualified person, or to someone who understood how to play the social game better? Here's the uncomfortable truth. In any human system, whether business, politics, or relationships, there are two sets of rules: the official rules everyone pretends to follow, and the real rules that actually determine outcomes. As Carl Jung profoundly noted, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The invisible rules governing human interactions are precisely these unconscious forces. When did you first realize there were unofficial rules governing your workplace or relationships? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. But here's where it gets interesting. Most of us were raised with a binary view. Selfishness is bad, selflessness is good. Yet Machiavelli observed something profound. Those who put others' interests ahead of their own inevitably lose power to those who don't. I witnessed this dynamic play out with two small business owners I advised. Michael built his marketing company on generosity, giving free consultations, discounting rates for struggling clients, and never turning away someone in need. Sarah built her competing agency on strategic value, offering free work only when it opened doors to bigger opportunities, maintaining firm pricing, and carefully selecting clients who respected her expertise. Within 5 years, Michael was burned out and barely profitable, while Sarah had a thriving business that allowed her to be even more generous. But on her terms. The difference wasn't that Sarah cared less, it was that she understood strategic selfishness. Consider this example. Two employees at a company. One works late every night, helps everyone, but never mentions her accomplishments. The other works efficiently, carefully documents his contributions, and makes sure decision-makers know his value. Who gets promoted? This isn't about becoming purely selfish. It's about strategic selfishness. Understanding when generosity serves you and when it undermines you. Carl Jung understood this when he wrote about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress because they don't fit our self-image. He knew that denying these aspects doesn't eliminate them. It gives them power over us. Have you ever regretted being too selfless in a situation where others took advantage? What would you do differently now? Tell me below. What I realized next completely changed how I viewed human nature. Nietzsche challenged us to look beyond conventional morality to a higher ethic, one that embraces strength rather than weakness disguised as virtue. Let me tell you about David, a middle school teacher I interviewed for my research. For years, David tried to maintain order through positive reinforcement alone. His classroom became increasingly chaotic as students learned there were no real consequences for disruptive behavior. Eventually, a mentor teacher pulled him aside and said, "Sometimes you need to show them you have teeth." David learned to implement firm boundaries with clear consequences, what I call controlled force. Within weeks, his classroom transformed. Ironically, once students felt the security of consistent boundaries, the positive reinforcement became more effective. Let me be clear. I'm not advocating for cruelty. I'm advocating for the courage to occasionally be feared rather than liked when principles demand it. Think about setting boundaries. When someone repeatedly violates your boundaries and polite requests fail, what's more effective? Continued niceness or a display of controlled force? Machiavelli would say it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Why? Because love is freely given and freely withdrawn, but fear remains constant. When have you needed to show controlled force to protect yourself or something you value? Share your experience if you feel comfortable. Most people give up here. Why? Because embracing these ideas feels like betraying our moral identity. But what if your moral identity is based on childhood programming rather than adult reality? If these insights about power dynamics are resonating with you, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. I'll be exploring more of these hidden truths in future videos. Now let's continue our journey. Everything you've been taught about showing vulnerability might be incomplete. We're told vulnerability builds connection, and it does. But Machiavelli would add, vulnerability strategically revealed builds connection. Vulnerability carelessly exposed invites exploitation. Let me share a real example that illustrates this perfectly. I once consulted for a tech startup where two team leaders had very different approaches. Rebecca believed in radical transparency and shared every doubt, insecurity, and challenge with her team and superiors. Marcus practiced what I call calculated vulnerability. He thoughtfully revealed certain struggles while maintaining a core of confident competence. When layoffs came, Rebecca's team was the first cut. Her constant expression of uncertainty had created an unconscious perception that her projects were at risk. Marcus's team was preserved because his strategic vulnerability had built authentic connection without undermining confidence in his leadership. Consider this. A leader who occasionally admits uncertainty appears authentic and builds trust. A leader who constantly expresses doubt appears weak and loses influence. The truth is, selective vulnerability is one of the most powerful tools in human connection, when you control when, how, and to whom you show it. Have you ever regretted being too vulnerable with the wrong person? What did that experience teach you? I'm curious about your insights, but here's where the real transformation begins. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few feel what you are. This Machiavellian insight reveals a profound truth. Perception often matters more than reality. I saw this principle dramatically illustrated in the story of two equally talented software developers I mentored. Alexis was brilliant but worked quietly, assuming her code would speak for itself. Jordan was equally skilled but understood perception management. He documented his problem-solving process, created clear visualizations of his contributions, and communicated in language that resonated with non-technical executives. When promotion time came, Jordan advanced while Alexis remained in the same position, confused and resentful. The difference wasn't their technical ability, it was their understanding of perception management. Think about it. When you're being evaluated for a job, a promotion, a relationship, people aren't judging the totality of who you are. They're judging the limited information they have about you. This isn't about deception. It's about understanding that managing how others perceive you isn't manipulative. It's necessary. Consider social media. Everyone curates their image. The question isn't whether to manage perceptions, but how intentional and strategic you are about it. What's one situation where you wish you'd been more strategic about managing perceptions? Share your thoughts below. What I discovered next completely shifted my understanding of ethics. We're taught that ethical principles are absolute. Always tell the truth, always keep promises. But Machiavelli recognized something more nuanced. Different contexts require different ethical approaches. This became painfully clear to me through my friend Elena's story. She had always prided herself on absolute honesty in all situations. When her sister was in an abusive relationship, Elena felt morally obligated to be honest with the abusive partner, about helping her sister plan her escape. Her moral purity put her sister in danger. Elena learned through this traumatic experience that context matters, profoundly in ethical decisions. Sometimes principles must flex to protect deeper values. Think about it this way. Is it wrong to lie to a kidnapper about knowing where someone is hiding? Is it wrong to break a promise when keeping it would cause greater harm? The higher ethical stance isn't rigid adherence to rules. It's understanding the real-world impact of your actions in context. This is what philosopher Immanuel Kant missed, but Machiavelli understood. Rigid moral principles can become immoral when applied without consideration of consequences. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where strictly following moral rules would have led to worse outcomes? I'd love to hear your experience. I thought I understood power dynamics, but what came next completely transformed my worldview. Here's the paradox Machiavelli recognized. To maintain good in the world, you must sometimes be willing to use methods that don't appear good. I witnessed this paradox in action through my mentor, Dr. Karima, a humanitarian physician. In negotiations with a corrupt official blocking medical supplies during a crisis, she abandoned her usual transparent approach. Instead, she leveraged relationships, applied strategic pressure, and even implied consequences that weren't entirely in her power to deliver. Was this ethical cunning dirty? Perhaps by rigid standards, but her tactical maneuvering got medicine to children who would have died without it. The paradox is that her willingness to employ strategic cunning served her deepest moral purpose. Think about negotiation. If you always reveal your bottom line immediately, if you're always completely transparent about your position, you'll consistently achieve worse outcomes for yourself and those you represent. Consider parents who tell white lies to protect their children's innocence, or leaders who must make difficult decisions that hurt some to benefit many. The paradox is this. Sometimes we must embrace smaller wrongs to achieve greater rights. And judging actions without understanding this paradox leads to moral confusion. Has there been a time when you had to do something that felt wrong in the short term for a greater good? Share your story if you're comfortable, but here's where most people get stuck. Many good-hearted people have an unconscious aversion to power itself. They associate power with corruption and abuse. But here's the profound truth. Power itself is neutral. It's the absence of power in good people that allows harmful people to dominate. I once worked with a nonprofit where this dynamic played out tragically. The organization was founded by idealists who refused to engage in power games with donors and politicians. Meanwhile, a competing organization with nearly identical mission embraced strategic relationships, learned the language of influence, and mastered perception management. Within 3 years, the strategic organization had secured major funding and changed actual policies, while the pure organization remained small and ineffective despite their genuine passion. Their power aversion didn't preserve their virtue, it limited their impact. When you refuse to learn power dynamics because they feel dirty, you don't stay morally pure. You become ineffective at creating positive change. Think about it. Would you rather have ethical people who understand power dynamics in positions of influence, or leave those positions to those who pursue power without ethical constraints? This is what philosopher Bertrand Russell meant when he said, "The fundamental concept in social science is power, in the same sense that energy is the fundamental concept in physics." Do you feel uncomfortable with pursuing power, even for good purposes? What beliefs might be holding you back? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts. What I realized next completely changed how I approach relationships. Machiavelli observed that generosity must be strategic to be sustainable. When you give indiscriminately, you eventually exhaust your resources and lose the ability to help anyone. I learned this lesson from watching Marina, a gifted therapist who burned out trying to help everyone. She took on clients who couldn't pay, extended sessions without compensation, answered crisis calls at all hours, and sacrificed her own health for others. Her colleague Thomas was equally compassionate but practiced ethical cunning in his giving. He maintained firm boundaries, referred non-paying clients to appropriate resources, and strategically invested his energy where it created the most impact. 5 years later, Thomas was still helping people, while Marina had left the profession entirely, crushed by burnout. Her unlimited generosity ultimately served no one. Consider this. When you constantly say yes to everyone's requests, you spread yourself too thin to make a meaningful impact anywhere. Strategic generosity means giving meaningfully where it matters most, and having the courage to say no elsewhere. It means understanding that how and when you give is as important as what you give. Think about oxygen masks on airplanes. You're instructed to secure your own before helping others. This isn't selfish. It's the only way to effectively help. Have you ever burned out from giving too much without strategy? What boundaries did you learn to set? Share your wisdom in the comments. But the most profound realization was yet to come. The greatest insight from studying Machiavelli isn't about manipulation. It's about integration. It's about embracing both the light and shadow aspects of your nature to become whole. Here's a powerful truth that changed everything for me. The part of yourself you lock in the basement doesn't die. It lifts weights in the dark and one day kicks the door down. I discovered this through my own painful journey. For years, I denied my capacity for strategic thinking, for calculated action, for protective cunning. Believing these traits made me less virtuous. Then I encountered a predatory individual who took advantage of precisely this blind spot. In that moment of crisis, all the strategic capacity I had denied came flooding back, but raw, unintegrated, and chaotic. I survived, but the recovery forced me to confront a powerful truth. Denying our shadow doesn't make us better, it makes us vulnerable. When you deny your capacity for strategic thinking, you don't become more virtuous, you become more vulnerable to those who haven't denied this reality. Carl Jung understood this when he wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Think about water. In its natural state, it can be gentle and nurturing, or powerful and destructive. The master doesn't deny either capacity, but learns to channel both aspects with wisdom. The most profound personal power comes not from rejecting your capacity for strategic action, but from integrating it with your ethical core. What shadow aspect of yourself have you rejected that might actually serve you if properly integrated? I'd value hearing your reflections. Another dimension of Machiavellian wisdom that's often overlooked is understanding the timing of when to apply force and when to extend grace. Consider the story of two leaders handling team mistakes. The first immediately punished errors publicly, creating fear but destroying psychological safety. The second never addressed performance issues directly, fostering comfort but allowing mediocrity. Both approaches failed. The strategic leader I studied did something different. She privately addressed significant errors when they occurred, but publicly praised progress, creating both accountability and safety. Her timing of when to apply pressure and when to offer support demonstrated strategic wisdom. Machiavelli observed that timing in human affairs is as critical as action itself. A hard conversation delayed too long becomes destructive. A kind gesture offered prematurely can be exploited. The master of ethical strategy understands not just what to do, but when to do it. As the ancient text Ecclesiastes puts it, there is a time for everything, a time to tear down and a time to build up. When have you witnessed the power of timing in handling a difficult situation? What did you learn? I'd appreciate hearing your experiences. What most people never realize about strategic thinking is direct confrontation is rarely the most effective path to change. Machiavelli understood that indirect influence, changing the environment rather than the person, often yields better results with less resistance. Let me share a personal example. Years ago, I tried to directly convince my sibling to address a destructive habit. My reasoned arguments and emotional pleas only created defensiveness and resistance. Later, I took a different approach. I simply changed what activities we did together, subtly shifting our environment to support better choices. Without direct confrontation, positive change emerged naturally. This is the power of indirect influence, understanding that humans respond more to context than to criticism. Consider how this applies in organizational change. Direct mandates often fail while thoughtful restructuring of incentives succeeds. Or in relationships, where changing your own behavior often creates more shift than demanding others change theirs. This strategic approach isn't manipulative, it's effective. It recognizes that human behavior exists in an ecosystem of influences rather than in isolation. Where might you apply indirect influence rather than direct confrontation in a current challenge you're facing? Share your thoughts if you feel comfortable. As we approach our conclusion, let me share the most practical insight of all. So where do we go from here? How do we apply these Machiavellian insights without losing our soul? First, recognize that strategic thinking isn't immoral, it's amoral. Like a knife, it can heal in a surgeon's hands or harm in an attacker's. The moral dimension comes from your intentions and goals. Second, practice discernment about context. There are environments where full transparency serves you, and environments where strategic opacity is necessary. Wisdom lies in knowing the difference. Finally, remember that true power isn't about controlling others. It's about not being controlled by others' manipulations. When you understand the rules of the game, you can choose when to play and when to change the game entirely. Which of these three practices do you find most challenging? What's one situation where you could apply it this week? Share your thoughts below. The parts of human nature that once disturbed you may contain the very wisdom you need to protect what you value most. By integrating Machiavelli's strategic mindset with your authentic values, you don't become less ethical. You become more effective at creating the good you wish to see. What's one area of your life where you need to be more strategically Machiavellian to protect something important? Your story might help someone else find their strength. Next time, we'll explore how these same principles apply specifically to protecting your creative work in a world that often exploits authentic creators. Because your voice matters too much to be silenced by those playing nice while others play to win.